my name is Emma Fisher, and as Tina just said, I am a senior majoring in religion and social justice. It is my honor to introduce you all to one of the legends of our department, Lucia Hulsether. Lucia graduated in 2011 with the Amazons. However, she's also a Green Class member, so go Green Class. After graduating summa cum laude with a BA in Religious Studies and Sociandro, Lucia headed to Harvard Divinity School, where she received her Master's of Divinity in 2014. After graduating from Harvard, Lucia headed to Yale, where she received her MA and a Master's of Philosophy from the Department of Religious Studies before working on her PhD in Religious Studies at Yale in the right now. That's totally fresh. She's been published everywhere from the Journal of American Academy of Religion to the Graphic Journal of Harvard Divinity School. She's presented at CSOR, the National Women's Studies Association, and even way back in the day, here at our very own SPAR conference. Lucia and her accomplishments are definitely nothing to sneeze at. We are truly honored to have her here with us today. Without further ado, and also she wrote this really cool article about post-colonial promise of universal drink, which is Coca-Cola, which is a big thing here in Atlanta, as I'm sure you all know. As I said, we are super, super happy that Lucia's here and able to join us today, and please help me welcome her. My mother is here. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Emma, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. It is just really a treat to be back here and to be back in the place that formed me intellectually and personally. And it's really an honor to have all of you in this room. And I'm very pleased that my mom wrote down 3.5 hours this morning. It's long, to be here. Yes, so many people, lots of different kinds of family are in this room. I'm going to talk a little bit today about interfaith cooperation in American Empire. And I just want to begin, I'm going to show this video clip as I talk, but I'm going to start just with the first 1 minute of it. So, can everybody see? Yeah.
Sacred ground is the landscape of the nation. It's the landscape of the community. It's the landscape of the movement that I'm proud to be a part of. And that's the movement that is extending the American project. And I think the spine of the American project is for us, is this idea that we're a nation that welcomes the contributions of all communities and nurtures cooperation between those communities. And we were the first nation in human history to have that idea, to believe in that dream. And there's still people who don't believe in that dream. And what that means is those of us who believe in the American project of pluralism, we have to be on the rise. We can't be shy. We have to live out our dream, which is the dream of George Washington, and the dream of Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln, and Jane Addams, and Martin Luther King Jr. And that's inspiring, and that's what Sacred Ground is about.
All right, so the speaker in this video is a man named Ethan Patel, who is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is a national nonprofit that promotes interfaith cooperation on U.S. college campuses and seeks to make interfaith cooperation a social norm. He wrote this book, Sacred Ground. He's also written 2 other books, one that just came out, I think, last week, and another one that's his autobiography. You might have heard of the Interfaith Youth Corps. You might have attended some of their events. They hold leadership academies. They have chapters on lots of college campuses. Interfaith Youth Corps, or IFYC, is trying to respond to a world where, according to its literature and its speakers, quote, increasing religious diversity is leading to increasing religious violence. The solution to this, according to IFYC, is to organize religiously diverse college students and really college students to build habitat houses, cook at soup kitchens, clean up local parks, tutor at elementary schools, and also have dialogue events like speed dating, which is like speed dating except for you introduce your religious background to somebody, or just simply reflect with a facilitator about what motivates them to do service. The hope is that participants in their programs will realize that whatever their differences, they share in common a commitment to serving others. There's another thing too, which is implied on the cover of this book and also in Ethan Patel's words about it. And that's a basic belief that service and diversity are core American values. By activating religiously inspired service commitments in connections with diverse others, the Interfaith Youth Corps seeks to build on the qualities that make America great. sound like laudable goals. To raise questions about whether or not this is true and how or why it came to be true could sound pretty out of touch and maybe even dangerous when we are living, after all, in the shadow of Donald Trump's Muslim ban and border militarization, as well as the ongoing war on terror. If you were trying to contest policies like that, you could do a lot worse than to say what really makes America great is not its military spending or its capitalist economy, but rather its commitment to diversity and service to others. Just going to make sure this continues to be awake. Today I want to invite us, at least briefly.
George Washington, see?
George Washington. Today I want to invite us to suspend that reaction for a moment in order to ask different questions grounded in a historical analysis of the interfaith movement and critical reflection on its present discourse, particularly around issues of white supremacy and U.S. neocolonialism. I want to ask questions like, what happens when diversity is claimed as the core value of the United States and indeed a ground of U.S. exceptionalism? What issues of power and dominance are covered up by rhetorics of cooperation, service, and multiculturalism in American empire? What common ground is being presupposed in this burgeoning interfaith movement, and is it a common ground that we, that you, that I want to stand on? So using Interfaith Youth Corps as a main case because of its dominance and its popularity, my wager today is that the Muslim ban and the attempt to stage interfaith dialogues between Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, Buddhists, and many others have more in common than we may be predisposed to think. To see why, we need to think about the contemporary interfaith movement in light of its own past and its displacement of race and racism as a structuring problem for U.S. history and politics. So some background. The Interfaith Youth Corps began against the geopolitical context that was and continues to be a terrifying climate for minoritized racial and religious subjects in the United States and beyond. In 2006, against newsreels of U.S. Army planes bombing the Middle East and CIA torture of Muslim detainees, IFYC declared that the true quality of the United States was religious diversity and it should return to that commitment. It was a relieving message to many, and IFYC grew into a national force which, as of this morning, has $10 million in assets from its initial shoestring budget as a Chicago nonprofit. From its humble beginning, it became an organization with over 400 chapters on college campuses that has trained thousands and thousands of young people to be agents of interfaith dialogue and to call American citizens to embrace diversity. In so doing, it drew on a long tradition of actors who throughout the 20th century imagined the United States as special because of its religious freedom and sought to build on those qualities. Now, if you've taken a U.S. high school civics class, or perhaps just existed in U.S. political discourse, you know that this moral imaginary of the United States as a place for religious freedom is an ideal that surrounds us. Children in American public schools learn that the country was founded by Protestant actors who fled religious persecution. Later, you may learn that this persecution was also exacted by U.S. founding fathers on dissidents within their own communities, the black people they enslaved and the indigenous peoples whose land they occupy. I'm not going to rehearse this whole history. Instead, I want to anchor us in a more recent moment when interfaith cooperation and multiculturalism rose as an American brand. This moment is in the immediate aftermath of World War II in the 1940s and 50s, when the United States was rising as a prominent world economic and military power. But one that was also very concerned about something, and that was the specter of communism and socialism as threats to U.S. power and markets. Enter, at this moment, a new stage of religious freedom talk, when politicians, clergy, and the press position individual consciousness and religious freedom rights against so-called totalitarian and godless communists who threaten to suppress not only individual freedom of religion, but also individualist freedoms associated with consumerism. These were articulated as extensions as the freedom to choose one's religion. The choosing one's religion could be compared to the choice about where to shop, or where to work, or how to treat one's employees. And perhaps if you read the newspaper, you see cases like the Masterpiece Cake Shop and Hobby Lobby, and you see how intersections between free market rights and religious freedom rights continue to come into public discourse, and we'll talk about that in Q&A. The point here is that the United States was seen as exceptional and constructed as exceptional in the mid-century because it provided not only for individual freedom within markets, but also individual freedom of religion, and that those things together made for a multicultural public and made the United States deserving of its place as the preeminent power in the world. So this mid-century moment is the moment when the U.S. begins to brand itself as diverse, as special, as Coca-Cola teaching the world to sing. We know this in Atlanta. Never mind ongoing contexts of segregation, racial terror, internment of Japanese Americans, the Vietnam War that are also happening contemporaneously. It's important to distinguish, I think, between the representation of diversity and the truth of diversity and the truth of justice. You know this drill. It's an issue that continues to be important to discuss today. When, for example, Nike puts Colin Kaepernick on its commercials that sell shoes manufactured by children in sweatshops, where the Army boasts its religious diversity of its chaplaincy program while targeting primarily black and brown people and many Muslims for death. When colleges boast about their religious their commitments to global leadership, even as they retaliate against primarily black and brown people on campus who advocate for living wages. Scholar of ethnic studies Jody Malamed describes these kinds of discourses as official anti-racisms. An official anti-racism is a performance of anti-racism in which someone in a position of institutional power talks like they are woke, but does things that enshrine whiteness as a norm. Another scholar, Ray Chow, argues that white supremacy is ascendant in these official anti-racisms and official multiculturalism. Something can look diverse and create policies of white supremacy. Diversity, again, is not the same as justice. So I've just given a lot of examples, but it might be unclear what they have to do with religion. What is specific about religious diversity in that year? Religious diversity in a discourse of global leadership that actually forwards economic, racialized injustice. I want to suggest that the language of interfaith dialogue and religious pluralism is one kind of official anti-racism, perhaps we'd say official pluralism. I want to ask, again, what relations of power do they obscure and what authority do they extend? And we're going to continue with youth. So, George Washington, that's what we just said.
Gives a message early in his presidency from a man named Moses Sessions, who's the leader of the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. And Sessions is worried. He's worried about the fate of his people, Jews, in this new nation, knowing that they've been hounded and hated for centuries elsewhere. And so he asks Washington whether he and his people are going to be saved. And Washington writes back a letter using these words: "This government will give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. May the Lord of all mercies scatter light and not darkness, and make us useful in our vocations, and give us each in our own way everlasting happiness." And I find that so inspiring. That George Washington, our first president, puts a stake in the ground for interfaith cooperation from the get-go and says, you're going to be safe here, and I'm going to make sure of it. I think the fact that the forces of pluralism have always defeated the forces of prejudice in America is inspiring and it's instructive. The more I read what George Washington wrote, the more I see how Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. and Jane Addams viewed America's religious diversity, which is that it is a fragile treasure that needs to be protected. The more I realize that the work we're doing here at Interfaith Youth Corps with college campuses and college students, I mean, this is work that would make our founders and our heroes proud.
Okay. So, President Washington tells Jews in Newport that they will be protected. And Newport is elevated as an origin of American religious pluralism and its ethic. I want to interpret this claim as an example of an official anti-racism and an official multiculturalism. It's no doubt true that Washington sent this letter, and it's no doubt good that he was committed to protecting religious diversity in Newport, but we have to ask what kind of religious diversity was he protected. And what else do we know about Newport in the 18th century? Those of you who have taken Mary Cain's History of Slavery class, which I highly recommend, one of the most important classes I took at Agnes Scott, know that Newport, Rhode Island, was the center of the U.S. slave trade during these years. There is a relationship between religious freedom for white Jews in Newport and other religious minorities in Newport who are white, and the genocidal trafficking in black flesh through that city. The guarantee of freedom and toleration for some was the captivity, torture, and genocide of Africans. The Truro Synagogue, you may or may not know, was built by slaves. The point of rehearsing this history is not to question the significance of Rhode Island's relative, and we need to underline relative, freedom for Jews who were fleeing their own persecution and violence in Europe. Instead, I'm trying to highlight the way that the interfaith movement often relies on a picture of the United States as a society that has mostly overcome racism. Eva Patel often warns college students not to repeat the mistakes of his young adulthood when, quote, this is from his book, he was too busy reading critical race theory to pay attention to what really mattered, religious conflict. One of the Interfaith Youth Corps' most common claims is that the United States used to be structured by what W.B. Du Bois called a color line, but now in the 21st century, a faith line has replaced the color line as the, quote, major problem of the century. The faith line separates not religious traditions, but rather pluralists who espouse the values of American citizens and extremists who do not. Especially in the years since September 11, 2001, interfaith discourses have found new life within arguments on behalf of many security and military policies that have accompanied the so-called war on terror. Consider how, when George W. Bush was invading Afghanistan during the month of Ramadan, he instituted an annual presidential fast-breaking iftar dinner and used the platform to distinguish between, quote, faithful Muslims from the, quote, killers who follow an ideology very different from Islam. Or consider how after the U.S. military assassinated Osama bin Laden, interfaith groups reveled in the military's choice to give bin Laden a, quote, Islamic burial. The military had, quote, treated their worst enemy with utmost dignity, said a press release from the interfaith organization Shoulder to Shoulder. Never mind the years of massive torture, extrajudicial killing, and wars that provided the background context for this trade, and the wars that portended it. Appeals to interfaith and pluralism walk a tricky tightrope, especially if they want to build communities of solidarity without reifying claims of American exceptionalism and the supposed terrorism of black and brown people internationally. We need only open a newspaper to see that the line between pluralists and extremists is religiously, racially, nationally, and sexually coded. They are religiously coded as Muslim. Extremists are racialized as black and brown. They're often homophobically coded as sexual and gender deviants, as in examples of terrorists being sexually crazed or repressed. They are situated nationally as outside the community of U.S. citizens. Populations that harbor so-called extremists are targeted for reform and development. The idea in global leadership is to bring free markets, to bring microfinance, bring American popular culture, bring initiatives for global leadership, bring interfaith dialogue programs, sometimes run by the State Department, bring the military to make sure it all goes well. When interfaith champions say that their goal is inclusion and common ground, this is no doubt true, and I have no doubt of the good intentions of many involved in these programs. What is also true is that these programs will operate to bring more people into the shadow and scope of American military and state power. The failure of pluralism abroad then becomes an argument for a pluralist expansion of the U.S. state, also the expansion of U.S. empire. We invade in the name of freedom, often of religious freedom and pluralism. We develop economies in the name of freedom. Threats to pluralism, in other words, will always be opportunities to expand pluralism's borders. As Patel says, we have to be on the rise.
If we're not advancing a proactive, positive public discourse about religious diversity, we simply forfeit that territory to terrorists and folks who want to dominate and folks who want to spread prejudice. Those people don't just go away. They get defeated. It's the forces of pluralism that rise up and live out the next generation of the American project, write the next chapter in the story of pluralism. And so Sacred Ground is a call to this generation's forces of pluralism. All the proceeds of the book go back to Interfaith Youth Corps to support the work that we do with college campuses and college students. And if the book isn't available at your local bookstore, tell them to get some.
As the Interfaith Youth Corps has grown and expanded, so has its ambitions to be part of what Patel calls the U.S. National Project. It has come very far from its days of organizing students to hold service events and talking about intersectionality. Now its staff have served on State Department committees where they consult on issues of religious diversity and national security policy. It receives grants from Boeing, which is an aircraft and drone manufacturer, from the Coca-Cola Company, from major Zionist lobbying groups. IFYC also recruits college leaders, both students and staff, to its events and trainings with the promise that the religious literacy formed in these events will prepare students for government leadership. It is currently seeking to build a new academic subfield and merge it with religious studies, interfaith studies, with the aim of creating such global leaders, which means leaders in security. Critical race analysis and analyses of colonialism are not part of the suggested curriculum. The target audience of this growing interfaith infrastructure is the audience in this room, students, faculty, and staff on college campuses. The project is to make you agents of religious pluralism and interfaith cooperation in a world that it depicts as religiously divided. Let me be clear that engaging with difference, finding ways to speak across breaches, and service to others are important values and practices for anyone who wants to build a better world. I think we do agree on this. But these are not ends in themselves. Diversity and service, again, is not the same as justice and structural transformation. Interfaith alliances may be instrumentalized towards many different goals, whether that is justifying the torture of CIA detainees or protesting it, to campaign for union benefits and worker justice, or to defend the rights of corporations to deny their employees reproductive health care. The point is that increasingly it seems mainstream iterations of a pluralist and interfaith discourse align with the ends of state and market power, so we can't take them at face value. Those of us who are inclined to react with enthusiasm at any project to build connections across difference, and I include myself in this, are overdue for critical reflection. Who is served by a pluralist project that is articulating itself as the American project? What sort of power is being assumed here? How is that power raised and gendered and classed and embedded in colonial dynamics? What is the relationship between this interfaith initiative to the state and to corporate power? How do I want to position myself in the fray? We have to ask ourselves this because we are the audience. We are the target population, and we are being trained to target others, not only for diversity dialogues, but also for diversity dialogues that, if refused, can justify domination and death. Thank you. All right. My experience with interfaith things, living in the buckle of the Bible Belt, has been, it's a bunch of Christian folks getting together to talk about their different kinds of Christianity. You know, it's not really been, I guess, what I would consider like a real interfaith dialogue. But then also, like, the point about, I didn't know that there was this community of Jews up in Cooperstown? Newport, up in Newport. You know, and I didn't know. But it made sense that the only time, and like this is how Jews, there's a book called How Jews Became White People, and it's a really good book. But the only time that Jews were accepted was when there was another benefit, an economic benefit, a racial benefit, another, it's like the Jewish community, we don't talk about that. And we don't talk about, our interactions with white supremacism and our complicitness in white supremacism because I really don't. But so that was very interesting.
Yeah, have you had conversations with Ibu Patel about any of this?
So the first time I interacted with Ibu Patel was actually at the Theological Initiative, which Courtney has attended, and he came and spoke in 2006, was the year it was founded. And then I introduced him at a conference event for United Church of Christ Youth. The main substantial dialogue where I brought up these critiques was online on a website called Religion Dispatches, and it was after the Boston Marathon bombings, in which Patel wrote a HuffPo piece about how the Boston Marathon block bombings had been caused by a failure of interfaith dialogue, and what we need to do is create more interfaith dialogues, and that will create more religious understanding. And I had been thinking about these things for a while, I was writing for Religion Dispatches at the time, so just wrote a quick article that said, here are 4 questions that we need to ask when we're faced with an interfaith project. But in this history, you heard me say some of these questions again. And he responded. And he said things, I can't remember the quote it directly, but that interfaith dialogue does serve ends in itself, and that Hulsether thinks that structural injustice is the problem that we need to solve. I think that we need to advance pluralism. And then we ran into each other at the American Country of Religion Conference and got into an hour-long argument in a reception. So we have interacted with each other quite a lot, and I'm sure we will continue as we navigate similar professional spaces. And I actually think we come down on different places in the value of the U.S. empire. One of the things that he articulated to me in this conversation, and nobody should be held responsible for what they say in a conversation, or you should be held responsible for it, but we can take it with a grain of salt. He didn't put this in writing, although I think it's kind of implied in his writings, that U.S. empire is a good thing. What U.S. empire has done is been established and promoted pluralism around the world. And I think, I don't think that's true. I think some kinds of differences are visible. They're different. They're able to be accommodated into U.S. public if they align themselves with the interests of the U.S. state, of U.S. markets, and so that's where we can have diversity if it's everybody drinking a Coca-Cola, but we can't have diversity if it's a union organizing for labor rights within Coca-Cola. So there are standards here, and they have to do with whose interests are being served. And I think Ibu Patel is rightly in some ways, and I think wrongly in others, very concerned about sort of basically having representation, and thinks that the U.S. is the best agent for enabling inclusion on a world scale. But we have such a bad track record of it. We have the United States is a paragon of inclusion is what universe? Yeah.
So, because I came in late, so interactive. From what I got from it, you were talking about how interfaith projects have been used to push the U.S. agenda. Mm-hmm. Have you seen projects where they're interfaith but they're not really worried about the U.S. agenda?
Or so I've seen. So you're definitely right. I'm starting to, how's interfaith discourse sort of embroiled in this U.S. agenda? Yeah, I've seen interfaith alliances that have been really anti-imperial. There's Interfaith Worker Justice, which gets together different clergy from religious backgrounds and tries to fight for union rights for laborers, and really has a way of talking about race and gender and class along with its interfaith commitments. There's a great organization in Boston called the Greater Boston Interfaith Network, which I interacted with a little bit when I was living in Boston, and they've done a lot of healthcare organizing. And so I think interfaith isn't just downright evil. It's really good, I think, in a lot of ways, and can be mobilized towards different ends. I think when I get worried about it is when interfaith becomes really a post-racial and post-gender category. Like the conflicts that really matter are religious conflicts, not conflicts around race, not conflicts about gender, not conflicts about economics. And so we have to ask questions about those things. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Yeah. Have y'all seen projects, interfaith projects that you think are really valuable? In Nashville, they're like, when I think of like interfaith projects that I think are really valuable, it's the small ones, where it's like three congregations come together and, have a food bank drive. Or, do community service. It's like, it's hyper-local. It's attuned to the needs of the community, and it's community members doing them. It's not folks going into other communities and doing things. I was at a sort of community consultation thing when I was in divinity school, and I was at Harvard Divinity School, and they were asking questions. Harvard is trying to be this interfaith center, and the question they were asking is, how can we be a multi-religious divinity school since divinity schools are historically Christian? And they brought in all these seminary officials from around the country, and they were just really wringing their hands. How do we do this? I don't really know. How do we have Muslims and Jews and Christians in one classroom? And how do we brand ourselves as plurals, fit, interfaith? And I've in other contexts critiqued this project as it has been staged at Harvard. Serene Jones, who's the president of Union Theological Seminary, raised her hand. And Union, there are many things one could say about Union, but one of the things is that they have this really intense history of racial justice activism among their students. And they did a lot of protesting in 1968, and brought them in student movements. They've done a lot of economic justice activism. Colleen Wessel McCoy, a religious studies alum, is working at the, what's it called? What?
Cairo Center.
The Cairo Center, yeah, so they're great. And Serene Jones, the president of Union at the time, was like, we've been doing interfaith service forever. Like when our students went and organized dock workers in New York, they were of different religious backgrounds. We just need to talk about that. What we were organizing around was economic justice. And we did have shared values, and people of different religious backgrounds were doing those things. We could brand this as an interfaith conversation, probably. So what was at stake in articulating a justice project that had to do with critiquing economic exploitation as an interfaith project? Was it a way of making it more approachable? Was it a way of depoliticizing it? Was it a way of taking away a race analysis? And those are the displacement pieces of it are things that I am continually concerned about. And so I do think that the local pieces of it that grow in context. There are lots of things that we could say are interfaith projects. The question is, why would we do that as opposed to talking about them in some other way? Yeah.
This is fascinating. So you've talked to the big guy, I don't remember his name is. But have you noticed, so this is kind of we were talking about official and the lived reality, so the official reason. What is the experience of ordinary people? Have you talked to ordinary people involved? Are they internalizing these things themselves? What's the notion of a good conversation? How is this structured in how I've never been to one of these things, so I don't know how does it, you have the guy that had articulated these things, does it actually trickle down to everyone else and doing damage further down?
Yeah, I think that there's no such thing as a total discourse from the top and then everybody just accepts it straight on. Actually, when I worked at the Youth Theological Initiative, we brought in interfaith youth core staff and coordinated an interfaith service project. And the Youth Theological Initiative at Counter School Theology has done this for many years. And I was really moved. I was both really irritated and really moved by how it unfolded. So there were certainly students from very conservative white evangelical backgrounds who had heard language about Muslims being terrorists and met Muslim students for the first time and realized that no, that wasn't totally true. So I remember their transformations, and then I pause and I think, wow, having a bunch of Muslim students, mostly women, wearing hijab, come in to be the education objects for these white students feels pretty exploitative to me. The role of minoritized religious and racial and gendered people is not to assist in the self-actualization of white people. So then I started asking questions about that. We did a service project. It was not a like protesting against homelessness in Atlanta. We went to this giant this organization called Books for Africa. Have you all heard of this? Where they package used books and send them to Africa. I don't know where in Africa they send them there. And somebody said, I think that having good facilitators helped, because we ended up having a whole conversation about the history of white schools sending their outdated used books to black schools in the Jim Crow South, and how was this like this, and then how was Interfaith stuff participating in it. So I think that the conversations that was an Interfaith Youth Corps event where we ended up having those conversations together. I think it does depend on the context. So it varies. I do worry about that being the frame. I don't know I know that there are some people around the circle who have been at IFYC events and it could trouble the top down thing.
I'm remembering one of my students, I work at Miracle College, which is near Knoxville, and I remember I sent one of my students to an IFYC event in Washington, D.C. This was when Obama was president, and was tied with IFYC, and so there were all these like President's Conference of Interfaith Youth. And so I sent this student there, and he's from Birmingham, Presbyterian kid, but whose grandfather immigrated from Lebanon. And so he was highly motivated. He still is. I mean, he's in Washington, D.C. now doing a master's in international education. So he's highly motivated to learn about the Middle East in general and Palestinians in general, specifically, and thinking about Palestine-Israeli stuff and just sort of Middle East conflict in the Middle East. So he's like a freshman, and he goes to DC for this IFYC thing, and so I'm trying. So we're debriefing afterwards. He said, "You just felt like a pep rally." Like after this goes together, like it was like a weird kind of revival where I was supposed to be like, "Yay, yay, yay!" Like nothing that I really cared about, which was what are the power dynamics in the Middle East and what's happening to Palestinian people and what's happening to Israeli people and how do we talk about this? Like he said, I just didn't feel like any of that was on the table. I just felt like I was supposed to be like, yay, let's all be together, go team, It was interesting that he wanted to like it, but he said, I just felt like I was at a football game the whole time.
I think that's a lot like how racial diversity is treated in Agnes. There's a lot of nominal diversity and lots of people of color. I think we're technically majority people of color. But there's not a lot of difficult conversations outside of specific courses
Or specific incidents. Something will happen and we'll talk about it, but we won't talk about the way that we as an institution perpetuate white supremacy on the TV, And even when we do have conversations about it, and this is the eternal struggle, the people who need to be there most never show up. Because it's always a voluntary thing, And the people who benefit the most don't show up. And it's always, the burden is always placed on the marginalized person or people to educate the majority. Which is just, that's not just an Agnes phenomenon, but it's also entirely not okay.
So I actually attended the IFYC less than a month ago, and I have to agree with you that it was like a big pep rally, but we all would eat 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and everyone would be like, yeah, it's time to learn about interfaith. like religious diversity in other countries look like. Because there was a time in the conference when we actually got to sit together and there were like different topics on different tables, and one of them was gender, I think, one of them was like political discourse, and I think there were a lot of students who were actually asking questions, and not much like the leaders of the conference. However, I think everyone still got a lot out of it, because then it was like we were asking each other all these questions and seeing each other's perspectives on topics like that. So
I think that's really cool, and I think it really dramatizes how I hear a lot of like, I was talking with a friend who was at the Interfaith Leadership Institute and had a bunch of student teachers. She had a bunch of students there, and talked about how from the stage, lots of people kept talking about Ibu Patel, like Ibu, like we have this sort of leader figure, but then there was a lot happening and there was room to push back among students themselves, and I think that really dramatizes how, and make a plug for the religious studies department at ISA, which I came from, for democratic spaces of pedagogy, where teachers and students are learning from each other. One of the things that I have found very difficult about engaging some of the interfaith things, and I'm curious about like those who have had experiences in IFYC kinds of worlds, is that every time, it's really easy when the frame is inclusion or pluralism, when you critique them, to say, it's like, hey, like, how are you engaging with Black Lives Matter? Like, I feel as a person, a queer person, that I'm not totally represented here, or that this is assuming a kind of masculinist leader, recipient kind of model. And that can be translated as, well, we just need to grow our borders, and we just need to add more people, and we just need to have more diversity here. And so what is a structural critique can get transposed as a mandate to make the organization bigger. And then we can see, and I think that, so the Interfaith Youth Corps has in various stages, oh, we need to add secular. So it's not religious diversity, it's people who orient around religion differently now. So it includes non-religious people. And so you always add new categories, but the basis of the project stays the same. That I hear, Maggie, is your name? Yeah. I hear Maggie saying that like actually like there are people who want to press back and like do different things within it. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds with IFYC. Do people stay? Do they shoot off into their own organization? Do they? I've known people who started in IFYC and worried that it wasn't talking about Israel and Palestine in ways that were accounting for issues of territory, land, and power. And so they decided to do their own thing somewhere else. Or I know that there was a point in sort of like 2008, 2009, 2010, when a lot of the African American staff of IFYC quit the organization because they didn't think it was working on issues of anti-Blackness in Chicago. And so there becomes context to build relationships and to talk to each other and to figure out what we want, what's our vision now. And that's something that IFYC is offering, even if we have critiques of it. Well, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for
Thanks for